At 2:17 in the morning, the emergency doors of Harwell General Hospital blew open, and four armed men dragged a bleeding stranger across the floor, leaving a smear of red 15 feet long. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. The staff just froze, because hovering directly above the roofline, visible through the ceiling skylights, was a black military helicopter with its gun pod trained at the building. Then the doors opened again. A man in full tactical gear walked past the chief administrator without a word and stopped in front of the nurse they had fired 3 hours ago. He removed his helmet, and he saluted her. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel do not wait for anyone. People all over the world are watching these unfold in real time, and I don't want you missing a single twist. Drop a like on this video, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened inside Harwell General that night started long before those doors blew open. Maplewood, Ohio, population just under 90,000, the kind of mid-sized city that shows up on regional maps but rarely makes national news. There was a minor league baseball team, a decent riverwalk, 3 coffee shops within 2 blocks of each other downtown, and Harwell General Hospital, a 340-bed facility that served as the primary trauma center for the county and 4 surrounding townships. It was not a glamorous hospital. The carpet in the administrative wing had been the same shade of dark burgundy since 2009. The vending machines on the 3rd floor accepted cash only. The elevator closest to the ICU had been temporarily out of service for 11 months. But the emergency department ran tight, the nursing staff knew their patients by name, and the night shift, those invisible people who kept the building alive between midnight and 7, was led informally, unofficially, and without any title by a woman named Allison Krebs. Allison was 34 years old. She had straight dark blonde hair she kept pulled back during shifts, a scar along her left forearm that she never explained, and the particular kind of stillness that some people mistake for passivity. She moved through the ER the way water moves, quietly, efficiently, always finding the fastest path. Patients trusted her immediately, sometimes without knowing why. She had a way of being completely present when she spoke to someone, like the rest of the room had stopped existing. She had been at Harwell for 3 years. Before that, there was a gap in her resume she described simply as federal contract work, which her colleagues assumed meant something administrative, something boring. Nobody pushed. She didn't invite questions, and she didn't volunteer stories, and in the rhythm of a busy night shift, nobody had the time to wonder too hard about what someone used to do. What mattered was what she could do now, and what she could do now was exceptional. The problem, and there was always a problem, was that Harwell General's chief administrator, Dr. Raymond Goss, had never once watched her work. He had read her file, noted her nursing credentials, observed her lack of a graduate degree, and categorized her accordingly. In his mind, the hierarchy of the hospital was clean: physicians at the top, administrators just beside them, and nurses arranged below in descending order of usefulness. A floor nurse on the night shift occupied the lower third of that mental diagram. The fact that Allison's patient outcomes consistently ranked above those of nurses with twice her years of service was a data point Goss had never bothered to examine. He was 51, compact, wore suits that cost more than a nurse's bi-weekly paycheck, and ran Harwell General the way a man runs a machine he doesn't fully understand, by controlling who had access to which rooms. 3 weeks before the night everything collapsed, a shipment arrived in the loading dock at the back of the hospital. Allison noticed it because she always noticed things that were slightly off, and this was slightly off. The boxes were labeled as standard IV supply inventory, but they came in a refrigerated truck, the kind used for organ transport or temperature-controlled biologics. And they were unloaded by 2 men she had never seen before, wearing no hospital ID, signing nothing at the receiving desk. They moved the boxes directly into Subwing C, a surgical suite that had been listed as closed for renovation since the previous spring. She mentioned it to her charge nurse, Tom Reardon, who shrugged and told her facilities management handled inventory decisions. She brought it up at a shift handoff with the day supervisor, who smiled and said she'd look into it. Nobody looked into it. 2 days later, Allison walked past Subwing C during a late break. The lights inside were on. She could see the glow under the door. She could hear equipment. Not construction equipment, not the hum of renovation tools, but the specific hiss of medical equipment under load. The sound of something clinical happening in a room that was supposed to be empty. She knocked. Nobody answered. She tried the handle. Locked. She reported it directly to Goss's office the following morning, submitting a written note through the administrative assistant because Goss did not take unscheduled meetings with nursing staff. The note detailed what she had seen and heard, named the date and time, and asked for a formal clarification of what was occurring in Subwing C. By evening, she had a response. Not from Gossi, from HR. It was a single paragraph informing her that patient care areas were managed at the administrative level, that nursing staff were not authorized to access restricted zones or submit unsanctioned facility concerns through non-designated channels, and that any future concerns should be routed through her charge nurse. She had already done that. She said so in a follow-up note. The follow-up went unanswered. On the third week, she saw one of the two unidentified men again. I was walking out of the hospital's back entrance carrying a medical cooler, the hard-sided type, orange, the kind used to transport biological specimens or controlled pharmaceuticals. He was not wearing a hospital badge. He was not accompanied by anyone with a badge. He got into an unmarked white van and drove away. Allison wrote down the van's license plate on her forearm with a ballpoint pen. That was the moment, she would later understand, that sealed what happened next. She requested a direct meeting with Goss, not through the assistant. She waited in the administrative corridor until he walked past and spoke to him face to face. She kept her voice level. She described everything: the shipment, the locked wing, the equipment sounds, the unidentified man, the cooler. Gossi listened with the particular patience of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation. When she finished, he said, "Are you aware that this hospital operates multiple research partnerships with outside contractors?" "I'm aware," she said. "I'm asking about this specific. And are you aware," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "that administrative decisions regarding those partnerships are not within the scope of nursing responsibilities?" "I'm reporting what I observed." "You're reporting speculation," he said, "based on a locked door in a truck." He looked at her with the expression of a man exercising significant restraint. "Carter, Krebs, whatever you prefer. You're a good floor nurse. Your patient ratings are fine, but this is not your department. I need you to understand that." She held his gaze for a moment. "I understand you clearly," she said. She did not drop the issue. She filed an anonymous concern with the State Health Department online portal. She didn't expect it to move quickly. Those things rarely did. But she filed it, time-stamped, detailed, documented. She kept a copy. Whether Goss found out about it or simply decided he'd had enough, she never knew. What she knew was that 4 days later, she was called into a meeting with HR and informed that her employment at Harwell General was being terminated, effective immediately, due to a pattern of conduct violations including unauthorized access to restricted areas, insubordination, and the submission of unverified complaints that created a hostile administrative environment. They had a security officer waiting outside the HR office to escort her to her locker and then to the parking lot. Tom Reardon was standing in the hallway when she walked past. He looked at the floor. She didn't say anything to him. There was nothing to say. She drove home, showered, ate half a bowl of cereal standing at the kitchen counter, and sat down at her kitchen table in the quiet. Through the window, the city looked exactly the same as it always did. The streetlights were orange. A dog was barking somewhere 3 blocks over. Ordinary. She thought about making calls. She thought about a lawyer. She thought about the license plate she'd written on her arm and later transferred to a notebook, which was sitting in the second drawer of her desk. She thought about things she hadn't thought about in 3 years. Then she went to bed, because exhaustion was a language her body spoke whether or not her mind wanted to listen. She was asleep by 10:30. She woke up at 1:48 a.m. to her phone ringing. It was Tom Reardon. "Allison." His voice was wrong, tight in the way voices get when someone is trying not to sound frightened. "I don't know who else to call." She was already sitting up. "What happened?" "There's a situation in the ER. We've got a critical trauma, GSW to the chest and abdomen, and something else. The patient is presenting with something neurological that nobody here can identify. Dr. Frisch is on tonight, and he's—" A pause. "He's out of his depth. Allison, I don't know what's wrong with this guy, but he's going to die." She was pulling on her shoes. "I'll be there in 8 minutes." You were terminated today. Tom, her voice was flat. I'll be there in 8 minutes. She made it in 6. The ER was loud when she walked in, the kind of loud that meant the controlled structure of the department was fraying at the edges. 2 nurses she recognized were moving fast between stations, their faces carrying the specific blankness of people trying to concentrate while something in their peripheral vision kept pulling at them. She followed their trajectory and pushed through the doors into the trauma bay. The patient was male, mid-40s, athletic build under the wreckage of whatever had happened to him. 2 gunshot wounds, one to the left shoulder, one that had entered the right side of his chest and angled downward. His clothing had been cut away, and the patchwork of bruising across his torso suggested he had taken additional blunt trauma before the shooting. His blood pressure was showing on the monitor, 74/40, and dropping. But it was his eyes that told her something else was happening. His pupils were unequal. The left was blown wide, the right was contracted to a pinpoint, and between those 2 data points was a neurological story that had nothing to do with the gunshot wounds. Dr. Marcus Frisch was at the head of the table. He was 43, board-certified in emergency medicine, technically competent in every scenario that existed inside a textbook. He had a habit of reciting differential diagnoses out loud as a processing mechanism, which worked fine when the diagnosis was within his experience base and failed completely when it wasn't. He was currently reciting possibilities that were all wrong. Allison stepped forward. What's his toxicology showing? Frisch looked up. His expression shifted through 3 things rapidly: recognition, irritation, confusion. You don't work here. His tox screen, she said again. What did you pull? Standard panel. We're still waiting on. Run a synthetic panel, she said. Specifically look for organophosphate derivatives and synthetic cholinesterase inhibitors. A beat of silence. Why? Frisch asked. She pointed at the patient's right hand, which was lying palm up at his side. See that? The muscle fasciculations and the thenar eminence, the unequal pupils. His heart rate is too low for hemorrhagic shock at this pressure level, which means something is interfering with his autonomic function. She moved to the monitor, scanned the waveform. His QT interval is prolonged. This man has been poisoned. The gunshot wounds are secondary to what's killing him. Frisch opened his mouth. Marcus. She said it quietly, without aggression. I'm not fighting you. I'm telling you what I see. Order the synthetic panel and get me a full set of vitals from the last 20 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was weighing in that moment tipped in the right direction. Pull the extended tox, he told the nearest nurse. Allison was already moving to the supply cabinet, calculating. She had been in the room for less than 4 minutes when the ER doors at the main entrance opened again, and the sound that came through was not the sound of another patient arriving. It was the sound of boots, multiple sets, moving in deliberate cadence, and the low, clipped exchange of people communicating in half-words and acronyms. She didn't turn around immediately. She was focused on the patient's airway, watching his breathing rate, counting the seconds between each labored inhale. Then one of the younger nurses made a sound, not quite a word, more like the sound a person makes when they see something their brain doesn't immediately categorize. Allison turned. 5 men in tactical gear had entered the emergency department. Dark clothing, ballistic vests, comms equipment, weapons holstered but present. They moved through the space with the specific economy of people trained to control rooms, and the Harwell General security guard who stepped forward to intercept them stepped back almost immediately without saying a word. Behind them, through the glass of the ER entrance, she could see more vehicles, black, large, government-plated, and through the skylight panels above, the distinctive silhouette of a helicopter, hovering low enough that its downdraft was vibrating the exterior windows. Raymond Goss appeared from the administrative corridor. He had apparently been called in, or had not left. She didn't know which. He was in his suit, which meant either he'd been here or he'd dressed fast, and neither option was reassuring. He moved toward the armed men with the expression of a man who intended to assert authority. This is a medical facility, he said. I'm the chief administrator. Whatever this is, you are required to... The man at the front of the group didn't look at him. He was scanning the room, and when his eyes reached Allison, they stopped. He was tall, maybe 6'2". The tactical gear didn't conceal the fact that he carried it like a second skin. Someone who'd worn this uniform not occasionally but for years. in places where the stakes of getting something wrong were not paperwork and reprimand, but something considerably worse. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw that curved toward his chin, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray that photographs always flatten to something duller than they actually are. He walked across the ER bay, past Goss, who said something else that the man simply did not register as requiring a response. Past Tom Reardon, who pressed himself against the wall. Past Dr. Frisch, who stepped back without being asked. He stopped in front of Allison, reached up and removed his helmet. Then he straightened and he saluted her. The room went completely still. Allison looked at him. She knew him, not from Maplewood, not from Harwell General, from somewhere that no one in this building had any knowledge of, somewhere that existed in a part of her life she had put down carefully, like setting a weight on a shelf and not touched since. "Sergeant Krebs," he said. His voice was controlled, professional. But under it was something that was not professional, something that sounded like relief. "We've been looking for you for 6 months," Raymond Goss's voice cut across the room. "Sergeant, she's a nurse. She was terminated this evening. Whatever you think you're doing." The commander's head turned toward Goss with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has a great deal of restraint and is currently exercising all of it. "Sir," he said, and the word contained nothing courteous, "I need you to step back from this patient and this personnel, and I need you to do that right now." Goss's mouth opened. That was not a request. The room around them was not moving. The nurses had stopped. The monitors kept beeping. The patient on the table was still losing ground, still fighting something invisible in his bloodstream, still running out of time. Allison looked at the commander, and she looked at the patient, and she looked at the room full of people who were all waiting to see what she would do next. She turned back to the trauma bay. "I need atropine," she said. 2 milligrams IV push right now. And somebody get me the manual override on the imaging suite. We're doing this without waiting for radiology." Nobody hesitated. Not the nurses, not the commander's people, 2 of whom moved immediately to assist. Not even Frisch, who picked up the atropine himself and moved to the IV line. Gossi stood at the edge of the room, and for the first time since she had known him, he had nothing to say. Outside, the helicopter held its position above the hospital roof. The lights in the parking lot were washed out by its beam. Through the glass, Allison could see more vehicles arriving, and beyond them, at the edge of the light, the dark edge of something she recognized as the beginning of a situation that was much larger than this room, this hospital, this city. But right now there was a man dying on a table in front of her. The rest of it would have to wait. "Clear," she said, and stepped into the trauma bay, and the people around her, trained soldiers and civilian nurses both, moved out of her way without being asked twice. The atropine hit the IV line at 2:23 a.m., and Allison didn't look up from the patient to see whether anyone was watching. She didn't need an audience. She needed a vein, a clear airway, and 30 seconds without someone asking her a question she didn't have time to answer. 2 of those 3 things she had. The questions kept coming anyway. "What's your read on the neuro presentation?" That was Frisch, hovering at her left elbow, trying to be useful and managing about 60% of it. "Synthetic cholinesterase inhibitor," she said, without breaking her visual sweep of the monitor. "Not organophosphate. The progression is too slow for sarin class. Something engineered, something designed to look like a stroke until it isn't. We don't have an antidote protocol for—" "I know." She adjusted the oxygen flow. "We're not treating the compound. We're treating the symptoms while his body buys time. Keep the atropine running and get me a second large-bore IV in his right AC. We're going to need the access." Frisch moved. That was something. The commander, she still hadn't asked his name, and he hadn't offered it again after the salute, which told her he understood operational tempo, had positioned himself at the foot of the trauma bay without being asked, which meant he'd been in enough medical situations to know where to stand so he wasn't in the way. 2 of his people were at the doors. One was on comms, speaking quietly in a frequency she recognized as encrypted tactical channel traffic, which told her there was a larger operation running outside this building that she was not yet fully briefed on. She filed that away. Later. The patient's blood pressure ticked up 2 points, then 3. The atropine was doing something. Not enough, but something. And she adjusted her mental calculation accordingly. He wasn't stable. He was less unstable, which was a different thing entirely, but in a trauma bay at 2 in the morning with a compound she couldn't fully identify running through his system, Less unstable was progress she would take. She leaned closer to examine the entry wound on his right chest. The angle was wrong for a random shooting. The bullet had entered high and lateral, tracked downward, which meant the shooter had been elevated, above street level, a rooftop or a second-floor window, not a face-to-face confrontation. Whoever had put this man on her table had planned to do it from a position they controlled. That was not a mugging. That was not a robbery gone sideways. That was an operation. Raymond Goss was still in the room. She registered him the way she registered background equipment noise, present, potentially relevant, not currently requiring direct attention. He had moved to the wall near the supply carts and was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching the scene with the expression of someone who had walked into a room expecting to own it and discovered that the furniture had been rearranged without his input. He didn't speak, but she could feel the pressure of his silence the way you feel a headache building before it arrives. She had more important things to feel. "He's biting down," said the nurse on her right, a young woman named Dara, second-year ER nurse, steadier than her tenure suggested. Jaws clenching. "Seizure activity starting. Get me 2 milligrams of lorazepam, IV. Allison moved to the head of the table, checked his airway, tilted the angle of the oxygen mask. "Watch his arms. If he goes into full tonic-clonic, I need you on his left," and she looked at the nearest of the commander's people, a broad-shouldered operator who was watching her with something between professional assessment and restrained urgency. "You on his right. Don't let him pull the lines." The operator looked briefly at the commander, who nodded once. Then he pulled off his outer gloves, moved to the right side of the table, and took position without a word. The patient seized. It lasted 40 seconds. Allison counted, kept her hand steady, monitored the airway, watched the clock on the wall above the door. 40 seconds of controlled chaos. The particular kind of chaos that looks like disorder from outside and like a very specific set of decisions from inside it. When it stopped, she let out a breath through her nose. "Lorazepam's in," Dara said. "Good." Allison checked pupils again, still unequal, but the right had relaxed marginally. She wasn't sure if that was improvement or just the postictal phase. She needed more information than she currently had, and she needed it from a source that wasn't in this room. She stepped back from the table, looked at the commander. "Talk to me," she said. "What was he exposed to and when?" He hesitated. 1 beat, barely a second, and she watched him calculate something behind his eyes. What he could say, what he couldn't, who was in the room, what the risk of withholding information would cost the man on the table versus the risk of disclosure. He made a decision. "Outside," he said. "I don't have time. 30 seconds, outside." He tilted his head toward the corridor. "Frisch can hold the bay." She looked at Frisch. He nodded, already moving back to the patient's head. She wasn't confident in Frisch's ability to manage the situation independently, but she was more confident in that than in treating a weaponized compound with no intelligence on what it actually was. She followed the commander into the corridor. He spoke quietly and without preamble. "His name is Warren Lyle. Undercover federal operative, deep cover assignment, 18 months in. He was extracted from his position 3 hours ago when his cover was blown. The extraction went wrong, his team was hit on the way out, and he took the gunshots during the ambush. The neurotoxin is a proprietary compound. We've only seen it twice before. Both previous victims died within 4 hours of exposure." Allison absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had received field intelligence briefings before and knew how to metabolize information fast. 4 hours from time of exposure or from symptom onset? Exposure. When was he exposed? Estimated 90 minutes ago. She did the math. It wasn't a comfortable calculation. What's the compound designed to do? Cross the blood-brain barrier and disrupt the cholinergic pathway in the brainstem. The target is respiratory center shutdown. Makes it look like a stroke or a cardiac event. Which is why it's hard to identify in a standard tox screen, she said. Yes. Have either of the previous victims received any intervention that extended the survival window? One of them did. Another medic, former Army, administered a high-dose pralidoxime regimen paired with benzodiazepine loading. It bought the victim 6 hours instead of 4. He still died? A pause. Yes, but it was enough time for us to get the intelligence we needed out of him. His expression didn't change, but something in his voice did. Something compressed. Something that had been held down and was not being released. We don't want that outcome with Lyle. He's got a family. He was 3 weeks from coming in. Allison looked at the wall for a moment. Not thinking, processing. There was a difference. I can try the pralidoxime protocol, she said. I'll need to push the dosing further than the previous attempt. If his system is more sensitive to the compound, the extended protocol might achieve better receptor recovery. But I need the full chemical composition of the toxin, whatever your people have on it. I can get that to you in now, she said. Not in 20 minutes. Now. He pulled a phone from his vest. 2 contacts of his thumb, then he was speaking, clipped, fast, and within 45 seconds, he had turned the screen toward her, showing a chemical structure diagram and an attached document with the compound's known binding affinities. She looked at it for about 12 seconds. Okay, she said. I need pralidoxime, high dose. I need diazepam. I need atropine on continuous drip, not bolus. And I need everyone in that room who doesn't have a specific role to step back 3 feet and stop talking. She went back in. The next 40 minutes were some of the most technically precise work she had done in 3 years, possibly longer. The compound was behaving almost exactly as the file had described, attacking the cholinergic receptors in a pattern that looked random until you understood the sequence, and then it looked inevitable, which was somehow worse. She didn't have everything she needed. She worked with what she had, substituting where she had to, adjusting the protocol in real time as the patient's vitals shifted and told her what was working and what wasn't. At one point, his pressure dropped so fast that Dara's voice went up half an octave calling it out, and Allison had 3 seconds to decide between 2 approaches that both carried risk and neither of which was textbook, and she chose the one that her instinct told her was right, and her training told her was defensible, and she pushed the medication before the second thought could override the first. The pressure stabilized. She allowed herself nothing, not relief, not satisfaction. She moved to the next problem. Through all of it, the commander stood where she had stationed him. He didn't offer suggestions. He didn't second guess. He responded to every request with either direct compliance or an honest, "I can't get that," followed by an immediate alternative proposal, which told her he had worked with medics before and understood the specific sin of false promises in a trauma situation. His name, she learned at the 20-minute mark when one of his operators addressed him, was Garrison. Not a first name. She didn't know yet if it was a first or last name, and she didn't ask. Garrison was enough. Raymond Goss had not left the room. She was aware of him the way you become aware of a sound you've been ignoring, slowly, then all at once. He had moved from the wall. I was standing near the supply carts again, but his position had changed, and the change was deliberate. He was angling toward a better view of the monitor data, of the patient, of the room's activity in general. She didn't address it yet. She was mid-procedure. But she noticed. At the 50-minute mark, Lyle's pupils equalized. It was small. It happened between one check and the next, and she almost missed it, and then she didn't, and she held her pen light steady and looked twice to be sure, and both pupils were the same size, reactive, tracking toward the light. His QT interval is normalizing, Frisch said from behind the monitor screen, and his voice carried something she recognized as disbelief. Not cynicism, genuine surprise at an outcome he had considered unlikely. The blood pressure climbed to 94/62. Not good, but survivable. Moving in a direction that was the right direction. Allison set down the pen light. She felt the tiredness in her hands for the first time. Not shaking. Nothing as dramatic as that. Just the particular weight that settles into your fingers when they've been doing precise work under high stakes for an extended period, and the stakes have just lowered by a fraction. Garrison stepped forward. He's going to make it, he said. It wasn't a question. He's more stable than he was, she said. He needs continuous monitoring. The pralidoxime protocol needs to run another 90 minutes minimum, and if his pressure drops again, I need to know immediately. But yes, she paused. He's more likely to make it than he was 40 minutes ago. Garrison looked at her. How did you know? He asked. The compound, the cholinesterase angle. You got there in what, 4 minutes? The fasciculations, she said. And his bradycardia pattern didn't fit the hemorrhagic picture. Those 2 things together. She picked up the chart and made a notation. I've seen organophosphate exposure before. This was slower acting, but the mechanism had the same fingerprints. She did not say where she had seen organophosphate exposure before. She did not say that the first time she had treated it, she had been 26 years old in a place whose name she was still not at liberty to speak, and there had been no hospital, no monitors, no atropine pre-drawn in labeled syringes. There had been a field kit, a flashlight, and a man who was alive when she got to him and stayed alive because she refused to accept the alternative. She did not say any of that. Garrison knew it anyway. She could tell by the way he was looking at her, not with the curiosity of someone who didn't know, but with the recognition of someone who did. That was when Raymond Goss spoke. "I'd like to know," he said, stepping forward with the careful authority of a man reclaiming a room he feels has been temporarily borrowed. "Exactly what federal authority you're operating under, and why a terminated employee is being permitted to administer medications to an unidentified patient in my facility." The word terminated landed in the room with a very specific weight. Garrison turned toward him, slowly. "Your facility," he said, and his voice was even, "is currently operating under a federal medical emergency declaration, which supersedes your administrative authority for the duration of the incident. Your terminated employee just saved a man's life using a treatment protocol your staff didn't have the training to identify." He looked at Goss the way you look at something you are choosing, very deliberately, not to step on. "I'd suggest this is not the moment for that particular conversation." Goss's jaw tightened. "She was removed from this hospital because I know why you removed her." The room went quiet in a different way. Garrison's tone had not changed, still even, still controlled, but the content of that sentence landed differently than anything before it. Not as a challenge, as a fact, as a piece of information that had already been gathered, stored, and assessed. Gossi heard it the same way. She saw it in his face, the slight shift behind the eyes, the recalculation. He recovered fast. "I removed her for conduct violations, which are documented, and Dr. Goss," Garrison said the name like a period at the end of a sentence, "I need you to step out of this bay." A beat. "This is my—" "I understand you believe that." Garrison took one step forward. Not aggressive, not physical, just deliberately eliminating the distance that had been providing Goss with a certain kind of psychological comfort. "Step out of the bay." Gossi stepped out. Allison watched him go. She watched the way his shoulders moved, not defeated, not frightened, recalibrating, the posture of someone who was retreating from one position in order to move to another one. She had seen that posture before, in people who had more options than they appeared to. She turned back to Lyle. "Check the drip rate. Check the monitor. Check the time." 3:41 a.m. She had been awake for over 20 hours and operating at high intensity for most of the last 90 minutes, and she felt it in the specific way that training teaches you to feel exhaustion, not as a reason to stop, but as information to manage. Dara was watching her. "You okay?" Dara asked quietly. "Ask me later," Allison said. Garrison came to stand beside her at the monitor. His operators had cycled. One was outside the bay, one was in the corridor. The one who had helped with the seizure restraint was by the door. Efficient rotation. She noted it the way she noted everything, almost automatically. "I owe you a full briefing," Garrison said, low enough that it was just between them. "You owe me a chemical composition report that I already have," she said. "What I actually want to know is who he is to you." A pause. Not evasive, genuine, as if the question required a more honest answer than a tactical one. "He was on my team," Garrison said, 3 years ago, before the undercover assignment. She looked at him. "So this wasn't just a recovery operation," she said. "It was never just a recovery operation." He was watching Lyle's chest rise and fall. "We lost contact with him 4 months ago. Some of the people at my command level had already written him off." His jaw shifted slightly. "I hadn't." Allison said nothing. She understood the specific weight of that, of being the person who refused to update the ledger to deceased when everyone else had closed the file. She had carried that weight before. It left marks. "What's on him?" she asked. "The intelligence he was carrying." 3 things. Garrison held up fingers without looking at them. First, the identity of a foreign intelligence asset embedded in a domestic federal agency. Second, the location of a weapons cache tied to 3 unsolved incidents. Third, he lowered his hand. "Third is the one that brought us here in the middle of the night. There's an operation scheduled, 72 hours out. We don't have a location yet. Lyle has the location. The air in the room seemed to shift. And if he doesn't wake up in time to give it to you, Allison said, then we don't get the location in time. She looked at Lyle, then back at the monitor, at the steady, fragile progress of a man's body fighting something it was never designed to encounter. He'll wake up, she said. You sure? No, she said, but I'm not going to act like I'm not. Garrison almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it got close. That was when one of his operators appeared in the doorway. Commander? The voice was flat and quiet, the tone that in tactical environments means something has changed and not in a direction anyone wanted. Garrison turned. The operator held up a tablet. On the screen was a feed. Security camera, exterior, the parking lot on the south side of the building. The timestamp was live, 3:44 a.m. There were 4 vehicles parked at the far edge of the lot. Not government-plated. Not police. Dark, nondescript, and sitting in positions that were not random. They were fanned in a pattern that covered the 2 primary exit routes from the south side of the building. They had been there, according to the footage timeline, for 11 minutes. Positive ID on the lead vehicle, the operator said. Plates are burned, stolen, 2 different states. But we got a partial on the driver when he stepped out to make a call. He tapped the screen and a grainy freeze frame expanded. Ran it against the database from the Lyle extraction. There's a 78% match. Garrison looked at the image for a long moment. The people who shot him, he said. Yes, sir. Allison was listening. She had not moved away from the monitor, but she was listening, and the calculation she was running now was different from the medical one. They followed him here, she said. Tracked him, Garrison said. Different thing. They were probably on him before the extraction went wrong, which means they know he's alive. They know he's in this building. He looked at his operator. Get Prentice and Walcott to the south wing. Do not engage unless they breach. I want eyes on all 4 vehicles, continuous. Sir? The operator was gone. Garrison turned back to Allison. His expression had not changed significantly, but the room felt different now in the way that rooms feel different when the thing that was theoretical becomes the thing that is actual. We may need to relocate the patient, he said. You relocate him now, and you interrupt the protocol mid-cycle, she said. If the pralidoxime drip is interrupted before him, I know. Then you understand what I'm saying. I do. He held her gaze. Which is why I'm telling you now instead of when I'm already moving him. What's the minimum time for the protocol to reach a stable breakpoint? She looked at the drip, at the clock, at the monitor. 38 minutes, she said. Garrison nodded once. Then we have 38 minutes. Outside, the city was beginning its faint pre-dawn graying, that hour when the dark isn't quite dark anymore but hasn't committed to anything else yet. The helicopter had moved to a position over the east side of the building, and through the east-facing windows she could see its searchlight cutting a slow sweep across the far parking structure. At the south entrance, 4 vehicles sat unmoving. And somewhere in the administrative corridor of Harwell General, Raymond Goss had his phone out, and he had been on it for the last 9 minutes, and the person he was calling was not the police. Allison knew about Goss's phone call 11 minutes before anyone told her. She knew because she had been watching the administrative corridor through the trauma bay's interior window, the long rectangle of reinforced glass that gave the bay a sightline into the hallway. And she had seen Goss's posture change. There was a specific quality to the way a person holds themselves when they are saying something they don't want overheard. The slight turn away from the open space, the hand that comes up near the mouth. The stillness of someone who is trying very hard not to look like they are doing what they are doing. She had learned to read that posture in places that were considerably less forgiving than a hospital corridor in Ohio. She said nothing yet. She had 38 minutes on the protocol clock and a patient whose pressure had climbed to 101/66, which was the best number she had seen on that monitor all night, and she was not going to divide her attention more than she already was. But she noted the call. She noted the duration. She noted that when Goss finished and pocketed the phone, he did not return to the trauma bay. He moved instead toward his office, the administrative suite at the far end of the east corridor. And he walked at the pace of a man who has just done something he considers necessary and is now waiting for results. At 3:58 a.m., Lyle's eyes opened. Not fully. Barely a crack, the lids heavy, the focus absent, but open, reacting. His right hand moved, a weak lateral drag across the blanket, and Dara caught it and said his name twice in a low voice, and his eyes moved toward the sound. "He's surfacing," Allison said. She leaned over him, pen light out, checking the pupils again. Equal. Reactive. "Mr. Lyle, you're in a hospital. You're safe. Don't try to move." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He swallowed with visible effort. "Don't try to talk," she said. "Not if you can hear me." A pause. Then, slowly, he nodded. Garrison had moved to the bedside before she finished the sentence. He didn't push in front of her. He stood at the corner, giving her the space she needed, but his presence at the edge of it was the presence of someone with a question that could not wait much longer. "Give him 5 minutes," Allison said, without looking up. "Allison, 5 minutes." She adjusted the oxygen flow. "His brainstem is still recovering. You push him for information now and you risk re-triggering a seizure, and then he's useless to you for another hour, and possibly worse." She finally looked at Garrison. 5 minutes. He stepped back. She spent those 5 minutes doing exactly what needed to be done and nothing else. Checked the drip. Monitored the interval. Spoke quietly to Lyle in the tone she used with patients who were scared and disoriented. Even specific grounding. "You're in Harwell General. You were injured. You're receiving treatment. You have people here who are trying to help you." She didn't tell him he'd nearly died. That conversation could happen later, in a room with better lighting and fewer guns. At minute 4, he said, "Garrison." The voice was wrecked, dry and thin, stripped down to its minimum. But it was a word, structured and deliberate, which meant his higher function was coming back online faster than she had conservatively estimated. Garrison was beside her in 2 steps. "I'm here," he said. "Kessler," Lyle said. And then, as if the effort of the first word had used up a resource he needed to refill before spending again. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. Then, "It's Kessler." "The asset," Garrison said, and his voice was level, but something behind it had sharpened. "The embedded asset, it's Kessler." Lyle's eyes closed. Not unconscious, Allison could tell the difference, and this was not unconscious. This was the exhaustion of a body that had fought very hard and was collecting itself. "The location," Garrison said. "Warren, the operation location." A long pause. Long enough that the monitor's beeping seemed to get louder. "Meridian," Lyle said. "Overland Terminal, 60 hours." Then he was out. Genuinely out this time, the sleep of someone whose system had finally declared a mandatory shutdown. His pressure was stable. His breathing was steady. The pralidoxime was still running. Garrison straightened and was on his comms before he'd fully turned away from the bed. The words were fast and compressed and partly obscured by the tactical channel's compression artifacts, but she caught enough. "Kessler, Meridian, Overland Terminal, 60 hours, verify through secondary, stand by for updated coordinates." She turned back to her patient. Behind her, the trauma bay doors opened, and the operator she knew as Prentice, compact, dark-haired, expressionless in the way that people become when they have spent enough time in high-stress environments that the face learns to conserve energy, stepped inside. "Commander, we've got movement." She kept her hands on the chart. She kept writing. She was listening to everything. "Which vehicles?" Garrison asked. "2 of the 4. They've repositioned. East lot now. They're not stationary. They're doing a slow circuit." "They're scoping the exits," Garrison said. "Looking for the loading dock, my guess. Trying to find a soft breach point." "Timeline." Prentice's jaw shifted slightly. 20 minutes. Maybe less if they've got someone feeding them the building layout. Allison set down the chart. She said it before she'd consciously decided to say it, and she said it with the same tone she'd used every time she'd had to deliver a fact that nobody in the room particularly wanted to hear. "Subwing C." Both men looked at her. "The closed surgical wing," she said. "The one I reported. If someone inside this hospital has been running operations out of it, they have access to the hospital's structural layout, floor plans, entry points, utility corridors." She paused. "If Goss has been working with whoever is in those vehicles, they already have everything they need to walk in." A beat of silence. "The phone call," Garrison said. 11 minutes ago. He didn't come back to the bay afterward." Garrison looked at Prentice. "Find Goss. Don't approach. Don't engage. Just eyes on. I want to know exactly where he is, and whether he's still on his phone. Prentice was already moving. Allison looked at Lyle, at the drip, at the monitor. She made a fast calculation. The protocol had 17 more minutes before it hit the stable breakpoint she'd specified, but Lyle's current reading suggested his system had responded faster than the conservative estimate. The minimum threshold might already be met. She didn't love interrupting it, but she had a feeling the next 17 minutes were not going to be quiet. "If we have to move him," she said, "we move him in the next 8 minutes, before they reposition again. There's a service corridor behind the imaging suite. It runs to the north utility wing, which has an exterior access point that doesn't show on the standard visitor floor plan. It's on the maintenance schematic." Garrison stared at her. "How do you know the maintenance schematic of this hospital?" he asked. "I've worked here for 3 years," she said, "and I made it a habit to know the building I was responsible for patients inside." He accepted that with a single nod and got back on comms. The next 8 minutes were a controlled compression of activity. She managed the patient transfer prep with Dara, while Garrison coordinated his team's repositioning, and the particular challenge of moving a critically ill patient through a service corridor at 4 in the morning without monitoring equipment was the kind of challenge that required making very fast decisions about which risks were acceptable and which were not. She stripped the monitoring down to the portable unit, kept the IV access protected, made sure the pralidoxime was in a transit bag that wouldn't introduce air into the line. Dara was good. She moved fast, anticipated the next step, didn't ask unnecessary questions. At one point, she looked at Allison over Lyle's unconscious form with an expression that said she understood that this was not what nursing school had covered and had made peace with that fact. "You've got him?" Allison asked, meaning the IV, meaning the head of the bed during transport. "I've got him," Dara said. They moved at 4:11 a.m. The service corridor was narrow and smelled like floor cleaner and something metallic that was probably a pipe issue that facilities had been ignoring. The lighting was motion activated and came on in segments as they moved, which meant they could see exactly as far ahead as the next motion sensor and not farther. 2 of Garrison's operators flanked the transport. Allison stayed at Lyle's head, her hand on his neck, feeling his pulse directly because the portable monitor's lead had developed a contact issue in the transfer, and she wasn't going to trust a reading she wasn't sure of. His pulse was 72. Regular. Strong enough. They were 60 feet from the north utility door when they heard it. Glass somewhere behind them and to the south. The specific sound of safety glass giving way under deliberate pressure rather than shattering. A managed entry, not an accident. It was followed immediately by the tactical channel coming alive in Garrison's earpiece, and his arm came up in a fast halt signal that everyone responded to without sound. He listened. 15 seconds. Then, they breached the south loading dock, 2 inside so far, possibly more behind. Allison looked at the door ahead of them, 30 feet. "Go," Garrison said. They went. The north utility door opened onto a narrow access road behind the hospital's maintenance yard. Not a road on any patient-facing map, not visible from the main street, flanked on both sides by equipment sheds and HVAC infrastructure that made it a natural dead ground. A black vehicle was waiting there. Not one she'd seen before, different from the ones in the south lot. A response vehicle, positioned during the last 8 minutes. Garrison's people loaded Lyle into the back with efficiency she could recognize because she'd been part of similar evolutions. The particular speed that comes from training rather than panic, each person doing their specific task without waiting for instruction. She climbed in after him. Garrison looked at her from the ground. "You don't have to. His drip needs to be managed for another 40 minutes, and you don't have a medic," she said. "Get in." He got in. The vehicle moved. Allison kept her fingers on Lyle's pulse and her eyes on the portable monitor, and her mind on the mathematics of the pralidoxime, and didn't let herself think about the hospital she'd just left, or the people still inside it, or the fact that she had no idea what was happening in the ER where Dara was still standing, where Frisch was still the senior physician, where the south loading dock had just produced armed men who had not announced themselves as law enforcement. She thought about those things in the background. They ran like a process she couldn't close. But the foreground was this man's pulse beneath her fingers, and she kept that in the front. At 4:23 a.m., the vehicle stopped. It was a church parking lot 3 blocks from the hospital. She would have found the irony of it funny in a different context. The location was clearly pre-selected. There was a second vehicle already there, and a man she hadn't met who Garrison addressed as Rourke, and who had a medical field kit that was significantly better equipped than what she'd been working with in the trauma bay. She looked at the kit and felt something that was mostly professional respect and only a little bit envy. Rourke is a special operations medic, Garrison told her. Former Navy. He can take over from here. She looked at him. He can support, she said. I'm staying on the case. Rourke, to his credit, did not look offended. He looked at her the way competent people look at other competent people when they're trying to do a fast assessment. Then he looked at Garrison. She's the one who ran the pralidoxime protocol? He asked. Yes. Rourke nodded once. Then she stays on the case. Allison was already reconfiguring the IV line from the transit bag to a proper stand. She heard the exchange without acknowledging it, which was the response of someone who had not needed external validation to know she was in the right place doing the right thing, but who noted the validation anyway. Garrison stepped away from the vehicle to get on his comms. She could hear fragments: Kessler, Meridian, confirmation request, federal liaison, breach at Harwell, and the particular verbal shorthand of someone running multiple threads of a complex operation simultaneously. She focused on Lyle. His color was better, meaningfully better. The gray-blue undertone that had been present when he arrived was resolving to something that looked like poor health rather than imminent death, which was a significant improvement. His breathing rate had normalized, his QT interval on the portable monitor was within acceptable range, and when she pressed carefully on his sternum to check responsiveness, he showed a purposeful withdrawal response, pain avoidance behavior, which required higher cortical function than reflexive movement. He was fighting his way back. She adjusted the drip. Your protocol worked, Rourke said, beside her. Not flattering, factual, the way medics talk to each other. It worked so far, she said. He needs imaging when we can get him somewhere with imaging. I want to see the brainstem structures before I call it a full recovery. There's a facility 20 minutes from here, private, secure, fully equipped. He handed her a new monitoring lead. Better adhesive. Your old one was giving a false contact. She accepted it without comment and replaced the lead. The waveform on the monitor cleaned up immediately. It was now 4:31 a.m., and what was happening at Harwell General was no longer visible to her, but it was not outside her mind. She had left Dara there. She had left Frisch. She had left a building that had just been breached by people with guns who wanted the man currently lying 3 inches from her right knee. And she had left Raymond Goss, who had made a phone call 9 minutes before that breach, and had then walked away to his office at a pace she had cataloged as deliberate, and whose encrypted files she had never seen, but whose behavior in the last 6 hours had drawn an outline she could read clearly. She pulled out her phone. Garrison noticed. He was back at the vehicle's open door, 1 foot on the running board, mid-sentence, with whoever was on the other end of his comms. She held up the notebook she'd pulled from her jacket pocket, the same one she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, the one with the license plate number from the white van on the first page and a column of dates and observations on the next 4 pages. She held it up so he could see it. He paused the comms call. I started documenting 6 weeks ago, she said. Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, personnel I observed entering and exiting Subwing C, 1 partial plate from a second vehicle I saw at the loading dock ago. She looked at him steadily. There's enough in here to establish that Goss was running something in that wing for at minimum 3 months before I was terminated. Garrison looked at the notebook. Why didn't you? Because I was a nurse who got fired, she said. And a notebook full of dates and license plates from a terminated employee is not evidence. It's a grudge. She lowered it. But combined with whatever your people found when they breached tonight, combined with the fact that the people who shot your operative arrived at the same hospital where that operative was taken, in a window that starts right after Goss made a 9-minute phone call, she let that sit. That's a different conversation. Garrison was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was not surprise. It was something more like adjustment, like a person updating a mental model they had already considered fairly complete. You came in tonight to help a patient, he said. Yes. But you brought your notebook. I bring my notebook everywhere, she said. Old habit. He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, the pre-dawn sky had shifted from gray to the color of old dishwater, that particular early hour when things begin to have edges again. Okay, he said. I need to make a call. Make it, she said, and went back to her patient. She heard him, partially. Federal Liaison. Evidence preservation at Harwell. Subwing C, sealed immediately. Do not let facilities personnel into that corridor. She heard the name of a federal agency she recognized, and the name of an oversight division within it that she knew by reputation, and she understood that whatever Garrison was setting in motion, it was not small, and it was not slow. At 4:49 a.m., Lyle's eyes opened again. This time, they opened fully. He looked at the ceiling of the vehicle, then turned his head and found Garrison, and then found Allison, and he spent a moment reading the scene. Evu in his arm, portable monitor, strange vehicle, 2 people he recognized and 1 he didn't. The calculation was visible on his face even in the dim interior light. Alive. Unknown location. Safe seeming. How long? He said. About 2.5 hours since you came in, Garrison said. A pause. Meridian. We have it. 60 hours from... We're working on confirming the terminal location right now. It's the Northwest loading platform, Lyle said. His voice was still rough, but it was carrying more strength now, more intention. Platform 7. The overland freight terminal near Meridian Junction. They're moving the device in a refrigerated cargo container. He paused to breathe. Marked as medical equipment. Allison's hands stilled. She thought about the refrigerated truck, the boxes marked as IV supply inventory, the men with no badge at the loading dock. She looked at Garrison. He was already on his comms. And then his phone rang. The secondary phone, the one he'd pulled from a different pocket, the one whose ringtone was distinct. And when he looked at the screen, his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. He answered, listened for 8 seconds. Then he lowered the phone. They found Goss, he said. She waited. He's gone. Garrison's voice was flat. His office is empty. His car is gone from the lot. He left while we were in the service corridor. The vehicle was quiet for a moment. He knew the building layout, she said. He knew the timing. And he had 9 minutes head start while everyone was watching the South Breach. Garrison nodded slowly. She had not let herself believe until this moment that Goss was fully in it, not just complicit through negligence or willful blindness, but operational. A participant with access and intent, and a running awareness of what was about to happen. She had suspected. The notebook in her pocket was 3 weeks of suspicion distilled into dated entries. But suspicion and confirmation were different things, and sitting in a vehicle in a parking lot at 5 in the morning with a man who had nearly died on her table and a federal operation spinning up somewhere to her north, she felt the weight of confirmed suspicion settle into her chest like something cold. He had used the hospital, he had used Subwing C and the restricted access, and the bureaucratic cover of administrative authority. And when it had mattered most, he had used the breach he'd called in as the distraction that let him walk out the back. She had reported him. She had documented him. She had been fired for getting too close. And he had walked out of his own office while federal operators were clearing his building. How far can he get? She asked. Garrison looked at his phone. Depends on how long he's been planning the exit. He met her eyes. But he made that call from inside the hospital, which means his comms are potentially on record. And his car has plates. He paused. He's not going to disappear. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him mostly, in the part of her mind that assessed probabilities and weighed evidence. But there was a smaller, colder part. The part that had spent 3 years watching a man exercise authority without accountability. The part that knew how easily a person with resources and connections could convert a head start into something that lasted much longer than it should. And that part was less certain. She turned back to Lyle. His pulse was 76. His color was holding. The pralidoxime line still had 20 minutes of runtime. Is there someone who can stay with him? She asked Rourke. Rourke looked at her with the particular expression that means a question is about to be answered with another question. Where are you going? He asked. She was already picking up her jacket. Back, she said. Garrison turned. Allison. Dara is still in that building, she said. And so is whatever Goss left behind in Subwing C. She looked at him directly. And I want to see it. A silence. My people are in there, he said. It's not secure. You can come with me, she said. Or you can try to tell me to stay here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his vest. The drive back was 4 minutes. She spent them looking at the notebook in her lap. Not reading, just holding it, her thumb against the edge of the pages, feeling the weight of what 3 weeks of careful observation had become. She had not known what she was building when she started. She had known something was wrong, and she had written it down because writing things down was what she did when she didn't yet have the power to act on them. Now she was driving back toward the building that had fired her, with a federal operative in the seat beside her, and a situation that had expanded in every direction simultaneously, and somewhere in that building was a wing that had been locked and humming with equipment sounds on a Tuesday night when it was supposed to be empty, and she was going to walk into it. The hospital came into view. The south side was lit up, vehicle lights, the sweep of the helicopter that had moved back to a hovering position overhead, and at the perimeter, 3 marked police vehicles that had not been there when she left. Someone had called local law enforcement in the interim. The ER entrance was cordoned. She looked at the south wing, 4th floor, where the subwing C access corridor met the main building structure. The lights were on. They had not been on when she left. Garrison's comms crackled. She heard Prentice. "Commander, you need to see the C wing. We got it open. You need to see what's in here." She heard something in Prentice's voice, not fear exactly, more like the particular register of someone who has encountered something that has permanently updated their understanding of a situation. She looked at Garrison. He looked at the building. "Ready?" he said. She was already opening the door. The corridor to subwing C smelled wrong. Allison registered it before she registered anything visual. The particular combination of antiseptic and something underneath it, something organic and chemical at once. The kind of smell that in her experience meant biological material and controlled temperature storage had been occupying the same space for an extended period. It was not the smell of a renovation project. It was not the smell of stored supplies. It was the smell of a room that had been doing active work. The door was open. Garrison's operator Prentice stood at the threshold, and when he stepped aside to let them through, his expression confirmed what his voice had already telegraphed. Not fear, but the recalibration of someone who had walked into a room expecting one scale of problem and found a larger one. She walked in. The wing was 4 rooms in a row, connected by an internal corridor that branched off the main access hallway. The first room had been converted into a staging area. Shelving units along both walls, cold storage units humming quietly, a central workstation with 2 monitors that were still on, screensavers cycling. The screen showed inventory management software, the kind used by pharmaceutical distributors, and the ledger open on the left monitor was running entries time-stamped across a 14-month period. She didn't touch anything. She looked. The cold storage units were pharmaceutical grade, locked, but with access logs on the exterior panels. She leaned close to one panel and read the last 5 entries. Controlled access, authorized by R. Goss, date spanning the last 3 weeks. The contents were not listed. The access codes had been used in the middle of the night, 1 a.m., 3 a.m., once at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. The second room was the one that changed the scale of everything. It had been set up as a pharmaceutical processing space, not manufacturing, but modification. Repackaging. She recognized the equipment because she had seen variations of it in a federal training context years ago. Relabeling equipment for pharmaceutical containers, precision measuring tools, a containment hood for handling volatile compounds. The containers on the secondary shelf were labeled in 2 languages, neither of which was English as the primary, and the compounds listed on those labels were scheduled substances, not street drugs, but controlled pharmaceutical agents of the type used in clinical anesthesia and procedural sedation, modified, repackaged, ready to move. He was running a laundering operation, she said. It wasn't a question. Garrison was beside her, photographing the shelves with a device she recognized as a tactical documentation unit. Clean pharmaceuticals in, rerouted out through the distribution chain, probably billing them to the hospital's procurement account as legitimate supply orders, then diverting the actual product, and using the hospital's cold storage infrastructure and receiving authority to bring the raw material in without customs flags. Medical supply shipments get different screening, Garrison confirmed, especially if the receiving facility is a legitimate licensed hospital with a clean regulatory record. She looked at the relabeling equipment, at the volume of containers on the shelf. This was not a small operation, not a few bottles moved for personal profit. This was a supply chain, structured and sustained. "How long?" she asked. Prentice answered from the doorway. "The access logs on the cold units go back 14 months. The inventory software on the workstation, He paused, reading from a printout one of the technical operators had pulled. Oldest entries are 18 months ago. 18 months. She had been working in this building for 3 years. Goss had been running this operation beneath her for 18 of those 36 months, possibly longer if the early records had been purged. She had filed supply reports. She had signed off on patient medication records. She had moved through the building every night trusting that the administrative infrastructure around her was what it presented itself as. She had reported the shipment 6 weeks ago and been fired 4 days later. He had known exactly how close she was. The third room was the one that made Garrison stop moving. It was smaller than the first two, and it had been arranged differently. Not for storage or processing, but for something that required controlled conditions and a clear working surface and access to the hospital's oxygen and suction lines, which had been tapped from the main building supply through a modification that would not be visible from the outside. There was a chair, medical grade, reclining, the type used in procedure rooms, with restraint attachments on the armrests that were not standard equipment. There were 2 IV poles. There was a portable monitoring unit similar to the one she'd been using with Lyle, and it had not been turned off. It was running, screensaver suppressed, and the last session data was still loaded on the screen. She looked at the session data without touching the screen. Vitals for a single patient. Start time, 9 days ago. Duration, 4 hours and 12 minutes. The readings showed someone who had been sedated, deliberately, to a calibrated depth, not a medical level appropriate for a procedure, but a level appropriate for maintaining consciousness, while inhibiting voluntary movement and self-protective response. The kind of depth used not for patient care, but for interrogation. She stepped back from the monitor. Her stomach did something she did not give it permission to do, and she managed it with the particular discipline of someone who has learned that the body's responses to difficult information are real and valid, and also cannot be allowed to interrupt function. He was using this room to hold people, she said. Garrison was very still. Lyle, she said. His cover was blown. Before the extraction, if they knew he was compromised, they would have wanted to know what he'd passed and to whom. They would have needed a controlled location inside an infrastructure they already owned, with access to medical resources for... She stopped. Looked at the restraint attachments. For managing a subject through extended questioning. Lyle was extracted before they could get him here, Garrison said. His voice was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling something that would otherwise not be controlled. But someone else wasn't. The silence in the room was the kind that occupies space the way water occupies a container, completely, pressing against every surface. She thought about the missing Americans, the ones Lyle had referenced. She thought about the 14 months of access logs and the 18 months of inventory records, and the fact that this room had been equipped and apparently used, and she thought about the chair with the restraint attachments and the sedation depth on the patient record, and she arrived at a conclusion she didn't want but couldn't avoid. The missing personnel, she said. Do your people have any information on where they were last confirmed? Garrison looked at her with the expression of someone who has just arrived at the same conclusion from a different direction. He got on his comms. She walked out of the third room and stood in the corridor for a moment. She was not falling apart. She was very specifically not doing that, filing the emotional response in the same drawer where she kept everything that needed to wait until the work was finished. But she stood still for a moment in the fluorescent quiet of the sub-wing C corridor and breathed, because breathing was a thing the body required regardless of operational tempo. Dara appeared at the far end of the corridor. She looked startled to see Allison back inside the building, and then she looked at Allison's expression, and her own face shifted into something more serious. The ER is secured, Dara said. Police got here about 20 minutes after you. Someone called 911 from inside the building when the breach happened. The men from the South Dock are in custody, 2 of them. The other 2 apparently didn't make it inside. They turned around when your team blocked the internal access. Frisch, Allison asked. He's okay, shaken up. He's been giving statements, Dara paused. Tom Reardon, too. Allison nodded. Gossie's PA, Dara said. Sandra. She's been asking for... I don't know who specifically. She's been asking to speak to whoever is in charge. She says she has something she's been holding for 6 weeks, and she wants to give it to someone before she loses her nerve. Allison looked at her. Bring her up here, she said. Sandra Voss was 53 years old and had been Goss's administrative assistant for 7 years. She was a small, precise woman who wore her reading glasses on a chain and kept her desk organized to a standard that the rest of the administrative floor had always found slightly intimidating. She had also, as it turned out, spent the last 6 weeks carrying a USB drive in the inner pocket of her work bag and telling herself every single day that today was the day she would decide what to do with it. She handed it to Allison in the corridor outside Subwing C. "He gave me the password to his secondary system 6 months ago," Sandra said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "He trusted me because I'd worked for him long enough that he'd stopped being careful around me. I think he forgot that I was paying attention." She looked at the drive. "I copied what I could. Billing records, communications, the calendar entries for the wing." She paused. "There are emails to 3 different addresses I don't recognize, and financial transfer records that I didn't understand when I copied them, but I understood better later." Allison held the drive. "Why didn't you—" "Because I was 60 days from my pension eligibility," Sandra said, and her voice broke slightly on the last word, and then didn't break again. "Because I have a daughter in graduate school and a mortgage, and because I told myself I didn't know for sure." She looked up. "I'm giving it to you now." Allison looked at her for a moment. "You did the right thing," she said, and meant it, and handed the drive directly to Garrison, who was standing 4 feet behind her. He looked at it. Then he looked at Allison with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the face he made when something exceeded his current operational model, which was happening with increasing frequency since she had gotten back in the car. He handed it to his technical operator without a word. The operator plugged it into a forensic isolation unit, the kind that prevented any write-back to the source media, and started the extraction process right there in the corridor. At 5:47 a.m., the preliminary read came back. Garrison took the summary printout. "Read it," handed it to Allison. The financial records were the lead item. 18 months of transfers structured in amounts just below federal reporting thresholds, the classic pattern of someone who understood money movement regulations well enough to work beneath them. The recipient accounts were offshore routed, which would take forensic accountants time to fully trace, but the amounts were significant and the regularity was damning. The calendar entries confirmed access to Subwing C on 37 separate occasions, always between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. The emails were in partial decryption. The technical operator was still working, but what had come through contained references to shipment schedules, a code name she didn't recognize, and in one message, a reference to the facility asset, which based on context and the surrounding schedule appeared to refer to a person being held. Below that, in the same email chain, a response. "Confirm extraction before the Carter situation escalates. She's getting close." The Carter situation. She was the Carter situation. Garrison was watching her read it. "He was tracking you," Garrison said. "Your report to Health Department. He had a flag on the system. The termination wasn't just about shutting you up. He needed you out before the next shipment came in, and he needed to move it fast." "The shipment I saw was the last one before the operation," she said. The timeline assembled itself in her mind cleanly and without effort, not because the logic was simple, but because she had been building this timeline for weeks without knowing she was building it, and the final pieces had just arrived. The compounds in Subwing C, the refrigerated cargo container at Meridian. He wasn't just laundering pharmaceuticals, he was supplying something. "The Meridian operation," Garrison said. "His supply chain was feeding it." Garrison was quiet for a moment. Then he was back on his comms, and this time the urgency in his voice was different from before. More directive, more compressed. The voice of someone who has just connected 2 things that changed the operational calculation entirely. She stepped away to give him room and walked back to the ER floor, which by now looked nothing like the emergency department she had worked in for 3 years. The south entrance was sealed with police tape. The loading dock corridor had evidence markers along its length. 2 federal agents in civilian clothes were photographing the nursing station, which struck her as slightly surreal. Tom Reardon was sitting in a chair against the wall with his arms on his knees staring at the floor, and he looked up when she came in. "Allison," he said. She looked at him. "I should have—" He stopped, started again. "When you first brought it to me, I should have taken it further." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made the calculations available to him at the time and had arrived at the wrong answer, and he was now sitting with the cost of that in a way that she suspected he would sit with for considerably longer than tonight. Yeah, she said. You should have. She didn't add anything to it. She moved on because there was still more to do. The federal agents on scene had been briefed, minimally, she gathered, on a need-to-know basis. And the senior agent, a woman named Delray, who carried herself with the specific efficiency of someone who worked public corruption cases and had long ago stopped being surprised by the variety of forms corruption took Allison's notebook with gloved hands and looked at it with immediate recognition of its value. You maintained this yourself? Delray asked. Starting 6 weeks ago, yes. Dates, times, descriptions, one partial plate. The full plate is on page 3, Allison said. That's from the refrigerated transport truck. I ran it informally, and it came back registered to a logistics company in Youngstown. I didn't have a way to go further without authority. Delray looked at the plate, made a note. We'll need a full statement, she said. I know. Allison looked around the ER. I'll give you whatever you need, but right now I want to know if there's any intelligence on the location of the missing personnel that Lyle referenced. Because based on what I just saw in Subwing C, that's active case territory, Delray said. I understand. I'm not asking for case details. I'm asking if anyone has checked locations associated with Goss's calendar entries that aren't this building. She met Delray's eyes. He has access to other properties. He's been running this for 18 months and he's careful. He wouldn't use the same facility for everything. Delray looked at her for a moment. What makes you think there are other properties? Because the third room in Subwing C had session data from 9 days ago, Allison said. But the modification to tap the hospital's oxygen supply is recent, maybe 4 months old, based on the fitting type. Before that, they needed a different location for anything that required sustained life support. She held Delray's gaze. So where was he before he had the wing set up? Delray did not answer, but she made another note, and the way she made it told Allison the question was not being dismissed. At 6:14 a.m., Garrison reappeared at the ER entrance. He was moving at a different pace than he had been. Not running, but covering ground with the particular urgency of someone who has just received information that compresses their available time. Goss's vehicle was picked up on highway camera 40 minutes ago, he said, heading northwest on I-76, toward Meridian. The air in the room shifted. He's going to the operation, Allison said, or he's going to warn them we have the location. Garrison's jaw was tight. Either way, we have less than 60 hours on the original timeline, and we may have just lost the element of surprise. Can you get ahead of him? We're working on it. There's a federal intercept request being processed and a coordination call with the regional field office happening right now, but it requires approval layers because of the jurisdiction, and he stopped. The compressed frustration of operational bureaucracy was visible on his face in a way it hadn't been before. It takes time we don't currently have a surplus of. She thought about that. Then she thought about something Lyle had said. Platform 7. The Northwest Loading Platform. A refrigerated cargo container marked as medical equipment. She thought about the relabeling equipment in Subwing C, about the compounds modified and repackaged, about a supply chain that had been feeding an operation for 18 months, and about the fact that Goss had been running it out of a hospital where shipments arrived in refrigerated trucks with no scrutiny because they came to a licensed medical facility. The manifest, she said. Garrison looked at her. The cargo container at Meridian. It'll have a shipping manifest, she said. The manifest will list the originating facility. If he repackaged everything through the hospital's distribution account, the origin address on record is Harwell General. She looked at him steadily. Which means federal agents can intercept that container at the terminal on the basis of an inspection warrant tied to the hospital, which is already under federal review as of the last hour, without needing the full intercept authorization for Goss personally. A pause. Garrison turned to Delray. Delray was already on her phone. The room became dense with activity. Not frantic, but concentrated. The purposeful kind that means people have a direction and are moving in it. Allison stepped to the side and let it happen, because she had contributed what she had, and the machinery that needed to move now was not machinery she could operate, and she understood the difference between being useful and being in the way. She sat down in a chair near the nursing station, the same chair where she had sat hundreds of times during slow overnight hours, charting by the desk light while the rest of the department breathed around her. The chair was uncomfortable in the same way it had always been, with the armrest foam compressed on the right side and the angle slightly off from where it should be. She sat in it and felt the full weight of the night settle across her shoulders. Not defeat. Something more complicated than defeat. The specific gravity of a night that has required everything and delivered everything simultaneously, and leaves a person sitting in the aftermath trying to locate the version of themselves that existed before it started. Dara came and stood beside her. She didn't say anything immediately. She just stood there, which was enough. "You should go home," Allison said. "Probably," Dara agreed. Neither of them moved. After a moment, Dara said, "What happens now?" Allison looked at the sealed south entrance, at the evidence markers along the dock corridor, at the federal agents in their civilian clothes moving through a space that had been, 12 hours ago, a functioning emergency department on a quiet Tuesday night in a mid-sized Ohio city. "Now," she said, "they go to Meridian." She did not say, "And I don't know if they'll get there in time." She did not say, "And Goss has a 40-minute head start on an interstate highway at 6 in the morning." She did not say, "And somewhere out there are people who have been missing for longer than they should have been, in a location that nobody has confirmed yet." She thought all of those things. She held them without speaking them. And then Garrison came back across the ER floor, and his face was doing the thing it did when information had arrived that changed what the next hour looked like. He stopped in front of her. "Warrants approved," he said. "We can intercept the cargo container at Meridian Terminal on the hospital nexus." She exhaled. "And Goss?" Garrison's expression shifted by a fraction. Not relief. He didn't do relief easily, but something adjacent to it. His vehicle was tracked to a rest stop on I-76 22 minutes ago. He stopped. He's been stationary for 19 minutes. He paused. He made 3 phone calls, 2 of the numbers we've already flagged. The third? Another pause, and this one had a different quality to it. The third is a number that's been disconnected for 2 years. It's a dead number. She looked at him. "He's trying to reach someone who isn't there anymore," she said, "which means his support network is thinner than he thought." Garrison looked at the door. "We'll have him within the hour." She should have felt something clean at that. She felt something more complicated. Not satisfaction, not yet, because satisfaction required a closed loop, and the loop was not yet closed. It was closing. The shape of it was visible. But Goss was still on a rest stop on I-76 calling dead numbers, and Meridian was still 60 hours out, and somewhere that had not yet been identified were people who had been in rooms that looked like the one she'd seen in Subwing C. Then Delray crossed the room toward them with a phone in her hand and an expression that was not quite what Allison had seen on her before. Something sharper, something that meant the case had just moved. "We got a response on the secondary property search," Delray said. She looked at Garrison. "Goss has a holding company registered to a property manager in Youngstown. The company owns 2 commercial properties. One of them is a former medical rehabilitation facility, 16 miles from Meridian." She held up the phone so they could see the satellite image on the screen. "There are vehicles on site. We're looking at thermal now. There are heat signatures inside the building that are not consistent with an empty facility." The room was very still. "How many signatures?" Garrison asked. Delray looked at the screen. 3, she said. "All in the same room. One of them is barely registering." Allison was already standing. The satellite image on Delray's phone was small and grainy and told Allison everything she needed to know. 3 heat signatures, 1 barely registering, a former rehabilitation facility 16 miles from Meridian, registered to a shell company that traced back to a man who had 4 hours ago been standing in her trauma bay telling her that a terminated nurse had no business questioning administrative decisions. She was in the second vehicle before Garrison had finished the coordination call. He got in beside her without argument, which told her he had stopped arguing with her instincts somewhere around the 4th hour of the night and had made peace with that decision. "It's an active extraction," he said. "My people run the entry. You stay back until the building is cleared. If one of those signatures is barely registering, they need medical on-site immediately on entry. Not after clearing, not after a full sweep. Immediately." A beat. "You stay behind the first threshold until I call you in," he said. "That's the compromise." Agreed. The drive was 16 minutes on roads that were still mostly empty in the early morning gray. She spent it running inventory on Rourke's field kit, which was in the back of the vehicle, because she didn't know what she was walking into, and she wanted to know exactly what resources she had. The kit was well maintained and well stocked, better than she'd expected, with 2 lines of controlled medications she wouldn't have had access to in the Harwell trauma bay, and a collapsible stretcher that could be assembled in under 90 seconds. She noted all of it and organized what she would need to reach first. Outside the window, Ohio in early morning was flat and quiet and looked exactly like a place where nothing like this happened, which was the thing about places. They never looked like what they were hiding. The facility appeared on the left side of the road at 6:31 a.m. It was a single-story building, long and low, the kind of institutional architecture that belonged to the 1980s. Brick facade, narrow windows, a parking area that had been resurfaced recently enough that the new asphalt was still slightly darker than the surrounding lot. 2 vehicles were visible at the far end of the lot, parked close to the building's east wing. Dark, nondescript. The kind of vehicles that tried not to be noticed. Garrison's team went in first. She waited at the vehicle with Rourke, kit ready, listening to the tactical channel on the earpiece Garrison had handed her before he stepped out. The audio was compressed and partial, but she could track the broad shape of it. Entry, room by room, call-outs. The particular shorthand of people moving through an unfamiliar space with controlled urgency. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Then Garrison's voice. Krebs. East corridor. Now. She moved. The inside of the building still had the bones of its former function. The wide corridors, the room numbering system, the utility rails along the upper walls where IV lines had once run. Someone had covered the windows of 3 rooms with heavy black plastic sheeting. Someone had installed a secondary lock on the door at the end of the east corridor. A padlock hasp, new hardware, bolted into the door frame with the kind of fastening that told you it had been done quickly and by someone who understood the difference between temporary and permanent. The door was open. Garrison's operator Walcott had cut the hasp. She went in. 3 people. 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s or 40s, all in clothing that had been worn for too many consecutive days. One man was conscious, sitting upright against the far wall, looking at the tactical operators with the careful blankness of someone who had learned to manage their own responses under sustained stress. The woman was semi-conscious, her breathing audible from the doorway. The shallow, labored cadence of dehydration and something else, something that needed immediate assessment. The second man was the one barely registering on the thermal, lying on his side, knees pulled toward his chest, and she could see the color of his lips from the threshold. She was at his side before she finished the thought. His name, she would learn later, was Specialist Damon Vare. He was 31 years old and had been in this room for 19 days. He had a pulse. She found it at his wrist, weak and thready but present. And his breathing was shallow but bilateral, which ruled out the worst scenarios and left her with a list of immediate priorities that she began working through with the systematic efficiency of someone who does not have the option of being overwhelmed. Rourke. She didn't raise her voice. Get in here. He was already coming through the door. She talked him through the initial assessment while her hands were doing it. Airway, breathing, circulation, the rapid primary survey that compresses a physical examination into 60 seconds of high-yield information. Vare was severely dehydrated. His blood pressure was absent from the radial pulse, which meant it was below 80 systolic. He had bruising across his ribcage consistent with blunt trauma, possibly old, possibly not. She couldn't date it without imaging. His abdomen was guarded, which was a concern she flagged verbally for Rourke and moved past for now, because the guarding was not acute and his immediate threat was circulatory. Large bore IV, right antecubital, she said. Saline wide open. Get me the second kit open and the collapsible stretcher ready. Rourke was already moving. She looked at the woman next. The woman. She would turn out to be Sergeant Priya Nassim, whose name would appear in Garrison's missing persons file under a photograph taken 2 years before this room, was regaining consciousness as Allison reached her. Her eyes opened and found Allison's face and stayed there with the fragile, careful focus of someone orienting after a long time in the dark. You're out, Allison said. You're out of here. Can you tell me where you're hurt? Nassim's mouth moved. What came out was barely a sound, but Allison caught the shape of it. My side. Left side. She ran her hands along Nassim's left flank, flinched response at the lower ribs. Possible fracture, possibly a week or more old, based on the palpable callus beginning to form. Not an immediate life threat, but an injury that had been sustained and untreated in a room with no medical resources, and the anger Allison felt at that, at the particular specific cruelty of it. She filed in the same drawer where she kept everything that wasn't useful right now. The third person, the conscious man, turned out to be a federal intelligence officer named Whitmore, who had been in deep cover when his position was compromised 11 months ago. He was the most physically intact of the three, which he acknowledged without pride. He had been used as an information source and treated as a commodity rather than subjected to the physical pressure applied to the others, because his value was informational and they had been careful about the packaging. He said that with the flatness of someone reporting facts about a supply chain, and it was one of the most difficult things she had heard all night. She got all three of them stable enough to move within 22 minutes. Vare required the most active management. She stayed with him in the back of the emergency transport vehicle that Garrison had called in from a federal medical unit stationed 40 minutes away, managing his pressure with fluids and positioning and the particular focused attention of someone who has been doing this work all night and has not yet reached the point where attention fails, though she is aware that point exists somewhere ahead of her. His pressure climbed to 82/50 by the time they reached the federal medical unit. Not good. Moving in the right direction. She handed him off to the unit's physician with a full verbal summary. 19 days, suspected blunt trauma, abdomen needs imaging, severe dehydration, current pressure and trend, IV access bilateral. And the physician listened without interrupting and nodded at the end and said, "Good work," which was not the most useful thing he could have said, but was the truest. She stepped outside. The sky was doing something she had not had the opportunity to notice during the last 5 hours. It was fully committing to morning now, the gray resolving into something blue, the sun not yet visible but its position announced by the lightning in the east. The air was cold. She hadn't noticed that either, until now. She stood in the parking area of the federal medical unit and felt the cold air against her face and let herself, very briefly, be a person who was tired. Not broken, not undone, just tired, in the way that is earned rather than imposed, the kind of tiredness that has a texture to it. The specific weight of a night that has demanded everything and received it, and left you standing in a parking lot at 6:50 in the morning, trying to remember what your hands feel like when they're not doing something. Her hands felt like her hands. Garrison came to stand beside her after a few minutes. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the same eastern sky she was looking at and appeared to be engaged in a similar process of recalibration. "They're all going to make it," he said. "Vare needs surgery," she said. "His abdomen. There's something in there that the imaging will find. But yes, they'll make it." A pause. "Goss was taken into custody 20 minutes ago," Garrison said. "Rest stop on I-76. He didn't run. He was still in his car when the state police arrived." Another pause, and this one had a different weight. "He was still trying to make calls." She thought about that. About a man sitting in a highway rest stop in the early morning, working through a contact list that had stopped working, trying to reach a network that had already begun to collapse around him while he sat making calls to dead numbers. "What happens to him?" she asked. "Minimum 14 federal charges based on what we have right now. The financial forensics alone will take months, but the predicate offenses are solid. Conspiracy, drug trafficking through a medical facility, unlawful detention, obstruction, aiding a foreign criminal enterprise." Garrison looked at the sky. "He'll have a very good lawyer. He'll be in a courtroom for a long time, and then he'll be somewhere else for a longer time." She didn't feel triumphant. She noticed the absence of triumph, the way you notice the absence of a sound. The silence where something used to be. What she felt was more like the resolution of a sustained tension, the moment when a thing that has been wrong for a long time is beginning, slowly, to be corrected. Not satisfying in the way movies made correction look. More complicated than that. More human. "The people in that room," she said. 19 days. Whatever information he traded, whatever he got for running that operation, she stopped. Was it worth it to him? "People like Goss don't do the math that way," Garrison said. "He wasn't selling access because he needed money. He had money. He did it because he could, because no one stopped him." He looked at her. "Until someone did." She said nothing. "You filed the health department report 3 weeks ago," he said. "It was in the queue. It would have triggered a review within 60 days, Standard timeline, understaffed department. If nothing else had happened tonight, that review would have started in another 5 to 6 weeks. He paused. We got here faster because you brought us a notebook. I didn't know it would matter when I started writing it down, she said. Nobody does, he said. That's not why you do it. He was right, and she didn't need to say so. They stood in the parking lot for another few minutes. Not because there was nothing to do, there was still significant amounts of everything to do, but because the morning had arrived and they were in it and the night had been long, and sometimes even in the middle of everything there is a moment that requires itself to simply be. Then her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, a Harwell General extension, but not one she'd called frequently. She answered, Ms. Krebs? A woman's voice. Professional, slightly formal, the voice of someone conducting a conversation they're aware may be significant. This is Judith Warmer. I'm the chair of the hospital board of directors. I'm calling because I've been briefed, in general terms, on the events of last night, and I want to speak with you directly. Allison waited. I want to begin by saying that I'm aware of the circumstances of your termination yesterday, Warmer said, and I want you to know that the board will be conducting a full review. Based on what I've been told in the last 2 hours, it's clear that Dr. Goss acted in violation of his administrative authority, and that your termination was retaliatory in nature and without legitimate basis. She had known this. She had known it yesterday when she was escorted to her car with a security officer at her elbow. Hearing it said out loud, in formal language, at 7 in the morning. After the longest night of the last 3 years still landed differently than she had expected. I'd like to offer you reinstatement, Warmer said, effective immediately, with full back pay for the period of wrongful termination and a formal apology to be issued by the board. Allison looked at the sky. There are staff in that ER who need a stable department right now, she said. Dara Osei is a second-year nurse who handled tonight better than most people with twice the experience. Tom Reardon made a mistake, and he knows it. He's useful, and he has a good shift management record. Whatever happens with the administrative restructuring, those people need to be considered. A pause. I'll note that. And Subwing C needs to be decommissioned, inspected, and cleared before it's returned to any hospital use. Understood. That's already being coordinated with the federal authorities. Then yes, Allison said. I'll come back. After the call ended, she stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. Garrison had not pretended not to hear. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized by now. Not quite a smile, but the version of one that his face knew how to do. You negotiated your own reinstatement by asking for things for other people, he said. I asked for things that needed to be asked for, she said. Most people, in that phone call, would have started with what they wanted. I know what I want, she said. I want to go back to work. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his vest and came out with something small, a coin, bronze, worn slightly at the edges from handling. He held it out. She recognized it immediately. Military Challenge Coin. The specific design of the 7th Special Operations Command, a unit she had operated alongside during her last deployment 3 years ago in a different life. She took it. You earned one of those a long time ago, he said. You earned another one tonight. She turned it over in her fingers. The metal was warm from his vest. How many people in this command know about tonight? She asked. Enough, he said. The right ones. She pocketed the coin. The drive back to Maplewood took 25 minutes. She sat in the passenger seat with her head against the window and did not sleep. She was too far past tired for sleep to find her easily, but she let her mind go still in the way it learned to go still during long operations, when the active work was done and the body needed to coast before the next demand arrived. She thought about the third room in Subwing C, about the chair with the restraint attachments and the patient session data on the monitor screen. About the 19 days Damon Vare had spent in a room that Raymond Goss had furnished and locked and billed in some accounting to a shell company that would take federal forensic accountants months to fully trace. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into work 3 years ago looking for ordinary. She had wanted ordinary. After years of extraordinary, she had wanted a night shift in a mid-sized Ohio hospital where the biggest crisis was a cardiac event or a bad MVA, where the hardest decision was which attending to call and whether the on-call lab tech would answer by the third ring. She had wanted to use her hands for healing without the weight of everything else. She still wanted that. She had not stopped wanting it. But she understood now, in the particular way that nights like this produce understanding, not as an insight, but as a bone-level recognition, that who she was did not have an off switch. The training didn't stop working because she'd filed it away. The instincts didn't go dormant because she'd chosen a quieter context. She had walked into a trauma bay at 2 a.m. to help a patient, and she had ended up in a room with 3 people who were alive because she was exactly who she was and had spent the night being exactly that. There was no version of her that was only a nurse. There was also no version of her that was only what the military had made. She was both, and the line between them was not a wall, but a hinge. And tonight it had swung open, and everything on both sides had moved through it. She was okay with that. When the vehicle reached Maplewood, the city was waking up. The morning commute was beginning. The coffee shops were opening. A dog walker was moving along the Riverwalk with 3 dogs of varying sizes and enthusiasm. A delivery truck was double parked outside the hardware store on Main. The ordinary machinery of a city that did not know what had happened inside its hospital overnight was running exactly as it always ran. The driver stopped at the hospital entrance, not the main entrance, which was still cordoned, but the north staff entrance, which was open and showed signs of the department beginning the slow process of restoring itself to function. She got out. The morning air hit her face, cold, clean, real in the specific way that outside air is real after too many hours inside a building under artificial light. Dara was sitting on the bench near the staff entrance, still in her scrubs, a coffee cup in both hands. She looked up when Allison came around the corner, and her face did several things at once. "You're back," Dara said. "I'm back." "The people from the satellite image, they're alive," Allison said. "All 3. Dara let out a breath that she appeared to have been holding for longer than the last 10 minutes. They sat together on the bench for a moment, not saying much because there was a great deal to say, and neither of them had the energy for it yet. The hospital was behind them, damaged and complicated and currently inhabited by federal agents with evidence bags, and also by the nursing staff who were triaging patients in a compromised apartment with half their usual resources, doing what they always did because the patients did not stop needing care because the building was complicated. "I'm reinstated," Allison said. Dara looked at her. "As of this morning, board chair called." "That's," Dara started and stopped. "That's really good. That's..." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "You were gone for, what, 22 hours? "Terminated for 16 of them," Allison said. "And in those 16 hours you..." "Went back to work," Allison said. Dara looked at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head, not in disbelief but in the way people shake their heads at things that are true and slightly impossible, and also, on reflection, exactly what they should have expected. The formal outcomes assembled themselves over the following days and weeks, the way these things always do, not in a single dramatic moment but in increments, each one landing with the particular weight of an official thing said out loud. Raymond Goss was charged with 14 federal counts at his initial appearance, with additional charges pending as the financial forensics progressed. His attorney was, as predicted, very good. The attorney was also working with a set of documented evidence that had been meticulously maintained, time-stamped, and corroborated by physical findings in Subwing C, satellite imagery, financial records from 2 continents, and the testimony of 3 federal personnel who had been held in a facility Goss owned for 19 days. The attorney was good. The evidence was better. The Meridian Terminal cargo container was intercepted at 9:14 a.m. on the same morning, before the freight manifest could be altered and before the container reached its next transfer point. The compounds inside matched the relabeling operation in Subwing C. The serial numbers on 3 of the pharmaceutical units traced back to a licensed distributor whose records showed the product had been shipped to Harwell General 8 weeks prior and signed for by a receiving supervisor who had since resigned and was now cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for a consideration that his attorney had negotiated in the first 48 hours. The Meridian operation, the attack that Lyle had been carrying the intelligence about, was disrupted before it reached execution phase. The details of that disruption were not made public, which was the nature of that kind of operation, but 3 months after the night at Harwell General, a brief federal press release noted the successful interdiction of a domestic attack planning cell and the arrest of 7 individuals on terrorism-related charges. It mentioned no names that connected to a hospital in Ohio. Allison read it at the nursing station on a Tuesday night, between patient charts, and then went back to work. Warren Lyle was discharged from the Federal Medical Unit after 11 days. He walked out on his own, which was more than the first physician had forecast. He sent her a message through Garrison. 2 sentences, no salutation. I heard what you did. Thank you doesn't cover it, so I'll just say, I know. She wrote back, get some rest, doctor's orders. Rourke told her later that Lyle had laughed at that for the first time since his extraction. Damon Vare needed surgery, as she had flagged, a slow bleed from a splenic laceration that had been sustained at some point during his 19 days and had been manageable only because his body was young and stubborn and had compensated beyond what it should have been asked to. He came through the surgery well and spent 3 weeks in recovery and was, by all reports from the Federal Medical Unit, a difficult patient in the specifically impatient way of people who are not accustomed to being unable to do things. She did not meet him in person until 6 weeks after the night at Harwell, when he came to find her. He was not in uniform. He was thin in the way of someone who had lost weight they hadn't had to lose and was working on putting it back. He walked carefully, with the deliberateness of a person whose body was still in negotiation with itself, and he came into the ER during a quiet afternoon shift and asked the desk nurse for Allison Krebs. When she came out, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. She recognized the calculation, trying to match the person in front of him to whatever he'd been told, which was presumably something. You look younger than I expected, he said. You look better than your vitals suggested you would, she said. He almost smiled. I heard you drove back to get into the building. I left a colleague in there. You didn't have to come to the second location. You needed a medic on site immediately on entry, she said. Not after clearing. He looked at her. You argued that with Garrison. I made my case. He let you in. He made a good decision, she said. Vare was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ER around him, the ordinary controlled activity of a department running normally, patients and staff moving through the space with the specific rhythm of a place that knows what it's doing. The south entrance was repaired. Subwing C was decommissioned and sealed pending the full federal investigation. The nursing station desk still had the same broken drawer that facilities had been promising to fix for 8 months. I heard they fired you, he said, before all of it. For 16 hours. And you came in anyway. There was a patient who needed help, she said. That's not complicated. He looked at her with something that was not complicated either, for all that it was large. Then he reached into his jacket and came out with something she didn't expect. A folded piece of paper, handwritten, and she took it and unfolded it and saw that it was a letter, short, signed at the bottom by 3 names she recognized as the names of the 3 people from the building in Youngstown, and below those signatures, 2 more that she identified as members of Lyle's extraction team who had survived the ambush. It said, essentially, thank you. But it said it in the specific language of people who understood what they were thanking her for. Not the abstraction of gratitude, but the concrete, particular fact of being alive and knowing the specific reason why. She folded it again. Tell them they're welcome, she said. You tell them, Vare said. Garrison wants to introduce you to the command, officially. He paused. Your military record, there are some things that were sealed for operational reasons that are being reviewed for declassification. Garrison thinks the full picture should be on record. She thought about the scar on her forearm, about the part of her resume she had described as federal contract work because it was simpler and nobody pushed, about 3 years of working a night shift in a hospital in Ohio and being the person nobody thought to look at twice. My record is fine, she said. It's better than fine, Vare said, and some people think the right people should know that. She put the letter in her pocket. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not discovered, not revealed, but seen, not as a credential or a classified file or a story someone told about a night that went sideways in the right direction. Seen as the person who had done the work all along, before anyone was watching, in the ordinary dark of a night shift in a mid-sized city, filing health department reports, and writing license plates on her forearm with a ballpoint pen. She had not done any of it to be seen. She had done it because it was right, and because nobody else was doing it, and because she was incapable of looking at a wrong thing and walking past it without at least writing it down. That was not heroism. That was not a superpower. That was a decision, made repeatedly, in small moments that did not feel significant while they were being made. The significance assembled itself later, the way the truth always does. Not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small true things until the weight of them became undeniable. "I have a shift to finish," she told Vare. He nodded. He understood that language. "Garrison will be in touch," he said. "Tell him I know," she said, "and tell him I'll answer." She went back to work. The ER was running. Patients were moving through triage. A child in Bay 3 had a laceration that needed 3 sutures and a distraction strategy, and Allison had both. The overnight coffee in the break room was old enough to count as a hazard, and she made a fresh pot because someone had to. The broken drawer at the nursing station still didn't close properly. She worked the rest of her shift with the same hands that had pulled a man back from the edge of a weaponized compound and carried a field kit through a service corridor and found a pulse in a dark room in Youngstown at 6 in the morning. The same hands she'd always had. The ones that had learned their trade in places nobody in this building knew about and had kept learning it every single shift since, in the fluorescent ordinary of a department that needed someone who showed up and paid attention and wrote things down and did not stop when the answer got complicated. Those were not small things. They had never been small things. She had known that. Now the world knew it too, and the difference between those two states of knowledge, private and public, invisible and seen, was real, but it was not the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was the work. It always had been. The night shift started at 11. She was there at 10:45, the way she always was, coffee in hand, checking the board, looking at what the day had left her and what the night was about to ask for. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and this time the people around her knew it. Reardon made a mistake, and he knows it. He's useful, and he has a good shift management record. Whatever happens with the administrative restructuring, those people need to be considered. A pause. I'll note that. And Subwing C needs to be decommissioned, inspected, and cleared before it's returned to any hospital use. Understood. That's already being coordinated with the federal authorities. Then yes, Allison said. I'll come back. After the call ended, she stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. Garrison had not pretended not to hear. I was looking at her with an expression she recognized by now. Not quite a smile, but the version of one that his face knew how to do. You negotiated your own reinstatement by asking for things for other people, he said. I asked for things that needed to be asked for, she said. Most people, in that phone call, would have started with what they wanted. I know what I want, she said. I want to go back to work. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his vest and came out with something small. A coin, bronze, worn slightly at the edges from handling. He held it out. She recognized it immediately. Military Challenge Coin, the specific design of the 7th Special Operations Command, a unit she had operated alongside during her last deployment, 3 years ago, and a different life. She took it. You earned one of those a long time ago, he said. You earned another one tonight. She turned it over in her fingers. The metal was warm from his vest. How many people in this command know about tonight? She asked. Enough, he said. The right ones. She pocketed the coin. The drive back to Maplewood took 25 minutes. She sat in the passenger seat with her head against the window and did not sleep. She was too far past tired for sleep to find her easily. But she let her mind go still in the way it learned to go still during long operations, when the active work was done and the body needed to coast before the next demand arrived. She thought about the 3rd room in Subwing C, about the chair with the restraint attachments and the patient session data on the monitor screen, about the 19 days. Damon Vare had spent in a room that Raymond Goss had furnished and locked and billed, in some accounting, to a shell company that would take federal forensic accountants months to fully trace. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into work 3 years ago looking for ordinary. She had wanted ordinary. After years of extraordinary, she had wanted a night shift in a mid-sized Ohio hospital where the biggest crisis was a cardiac event or a bad MVA, where the hardest decision was which attending to call and whether the on-call lab tech would answer by the 3rd ring. She had wanted to use her hands for healing without the weight of everything else. She still wanted that. She had not stopped wanting it. But she understood now, in the particular way that nights like this produce understanding, not as an insight but as a bone-level recognition, that who she was did not have an off switch. The training didn't stop working because she'd filed it away. The instincts didn't go dormant because she'd chosen a quieter context. She had walked into a trauma bay at 2 a.m. to help a patient, and she had ended up in a room with 3 people who were alive because she was exactly who she was and had spent the night being exactly that. There was no version of her that was only a nurse. There was also no version of her that was only what the military had made. She was both, and the line between them was not a wall but a hinge. And tonight it had swung open, and everything on both sides had moved through it. She was okay with that. When the vehicle reached Maplewood, the city was waking up. The morning commute was beginning. The coffee shops were opening. A dog walker was moving along the river walk with 3 dogs of varying sizes and enthusiasm. A delivery truck was double parked outside the hardware store on Main. The ordinary machinery of a city that did not know what had happened inside its hospital overnight was running exactly as it always ran. The driver stopped at the hospital entrance, not the main entrance, which was still cordoned, but the north staff entrance, which was open and showed signs of the department beginning the slow process of restoring itself to function. She got out. The morning air hit her face, cold, clean, real, in the specific way that outside air is real after too many hours inside a building under artificial light. Dara was sitting on the bench near the staff entrance, still in her scrubs, a coffee cup in both hands. She looked up when Allison came around the corner, and her face did several things at once. "You're back," Dara said. "I'm back." "The people from the satellite image, they're alive," Allison said. "All 3. Dara let out a breath that she appeared to have been holding for longer than the last 10 minutes. They sat together on the bench for a moment, not saying much because there was a great deal to say, and neither of them had the energy for it yet. The hospital was behind them, damaged and complicated and currently inhabited by federal agents with evidence bags, and also by the nursing staff who were triaging patients in a compromised apartment with half their usual resources, doing what they always did because the patients did not stop needing care because the building was complicated. "I'm reinstated," Allison said. Dara looked at her. "As of this morning, board chair called." "That's..." Dara started and stopped. "That's really good. That's..." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "You were gone for, 22 hours? "Terminated for 16 of them," Allison said. "And in those 16 hours you..." "Went back to work," Allison said. Dara looked at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head, not in disbelief, but in the way people shake their heads at things that are true and slightly impossible, and also, on reflection, exactly what they should have expected. The formal outcomes assembled themselves over the following days and weeks, the way these things always do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in increments, each one landing with the particular weight of an official thing said out loud. Raymond Goss was charged with 14 federal counts at his initial appearance, with additional charges pending as the financial forensics progressed. His attorney was, as predicted, very good. The attorney was also working with a set of documented evidence that had been meticulously maintained, time-stamped, and corroborated by physical findings in Subwing C, satellite imagery, financial records from 2 continents, and the testimony of 3 federal personnel who had been held in a facility Goss owned for 19 days. The attorney was good. The evidence was better. The Meridian Terminal cargo container was intercepted at 9:14 a.m. on the same morning, before the freight manifest could be altered, and before the container reached its next transfer point. The compounds inside matched the relabeling operation in Subwing C. The serial numbers on 3 of the pharmaceutical units traced back to a licensed distributor whose records showed the product had been shipped to Harwell General 8 weeks prior and signed for by a receiving supervisor who had since resigned and was now cooperating with federal investigators, in exchange for a consideration that his attorney had negotiated in the first 48 hours. The Meridian operation, the attack that Lyle had been carrying the intelligence about, was disrupted before it reached execution phase. The details of that disruption were not made public, which was the nature of that kind of operation, but 3 months after the night at Harwell General, a brief federal press release noted the successful interdiction of a domestic attack planning cell and the arrest of 7 individuals on terrorism-related charges. It mentioned no names that connected to a hospital in Ohio. Allison read it at the nursing station on a Tuesday night, between patient charts, and then went back to work. Warren Lyle was discharged from the federal medical unit after 11 days. He walked out on his own, which was more than the first physician had forecast. He sent her a message through Garrison, 2 sentences, no salutation. "I heard what you did. Thank you doesn't cover it, so I'll just say I know. She wrote back, "Get some rest. Doctor's orders." Rourke told her later that Lyle had laughed at that for the first time since his extraction. Damon Vare needed surgery, as she had flagged, a slow bleed from a splenic laceration that had been sustained at some point during his 19 days and had been manageable only because his body was young and stubborn and had compensated beyond what it should have been asked to. He came through the surgery well and spent 3 weeks in recovery and was, by all reports from the Federal Medical Unit, a difficult patient in the specifically impatient way of people who are not accustomed to being unable to do things. She did not meet him in person until 6 weeks after the night at Harwell, when he came to find her. He was not in uniform. He was thin in the way of someone who had lost weight they hadn't had to lose and was working on putting it back. He walked carefully, with the deliberateness of a person whose body was still in negotiation with itself, and he came into the ER during a quiet afternoon shift and asked the desk nurse for Allison Krebs. When she came out, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. She recognized the calculation, trying to match the person in front of him to whatever he'd been told, which was presumably something. "You look younger than I expected," he said. "You look better than your vitals suggested you would," she said. He almost smiled. "I heard you drove back to get into the building. I left a colleague in there." "You didn't have to come to the second location. You needed a medic on site immediately on entry," she said. "Not after clearing." He looked at her. "You argued that with Garrison." "I made my case." "He let you in." "He made a good decision," she said. Vare was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ER around him, the ordinary controlled activity of a department running normally, patients and staff moving through the space with the specific rhythm of a place that knows what it's doing. The south entrance was repaired. Subwing C was decommissioned and sealed pending the full federal investigation. The nursing station desk still had the same broken drawer that facilities had been promising to fix for 8 months. "I heard they fired you," he said, "before all of it. For 16 hours. And you came in anyway." "There was a patient who needed help," she said. "That's not complicated." He looked at her with something that was not complicated either, for all that it was large. Then he reached into his jacket and came out with something she didn't expect. A folded piece of paper, handwritten, and she took it and unfolded it and saw that it was a letter, short, signed at the bottom by 3 names she recognized as the names of the 3 people from the building in Youngstown, and below those signatures, 2 more that she identified as members of Lyle's extraction team who had survived the ambush. It said, essentially, "Thank you," but it said it in the specific language of people who understood what they were thanking her for. Not the abstraction of gratitude, but the concrete, particular fact of being alive and knowing the specific reason why. She folded it again. "Tell them they're welcome," she said. "You tell them," Vare said. "Garrison wants to introduce you to the command, officially." He paused. "Your military record. There are some things that were sealed for operational reasons that are being reviewed for declassification. Garrison thinks the full picture should be on record." She thought about the scar on her forearm, about the part of her resume she had described as federal contract work because it was simpler and nobody pushed, about 3 years of working a night shift in a hospital in Ohio and being the person nobody thought to look at twice. "My record is fine," she said. "It's better than fine," Vare said, "and some people think the right people should know that." She put the letter in her pocket. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not discovered, not revealed, but seen. Not as a credential or a classified file or a story someone told about a night that went sideways in the right direction. Seen as the person who had done the work all along, before anyone was watching, in the ordinary dark of a night shift in a mid-sized city, filing health department reports, and writing license plates on her forearm with a ballpoint pen. She had not done any of it to be seen. She had done it because it was right, and because nobody else was doing it, and because she was incapable of looking at a wrong thing and walking past it without at least writing it down. That was not heroism. That was not a superpower. That was a decision, made repeatedly, in small moments that did not feel significant while they were being made. The significance assembled itself later, the way the truth always does, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small true things until the weight of them became undeniable. "I have a shift to finish," she told Vare. He nodded. He understood that language. "Garrison will be in touch," he said. "Tell him I know," she said, and tell him I'll answer." She went back to work. The ER was running. Patients were moving through triage. A child in Bay 3 had a laceration that needed 3 sutures and a distraction strategy, and Allison had both. The overnight coffee in the break room was old enough to count as a hazard, and she made a fresh pot because someone had to. The broken drawer at the nursing station still didn't close properly. She worked the rest of her shift with the same hands that had pulled a man back from the edge of a weaponized compound and carried a field kit through a service corridor and found a pulse in a dark room in Youngstown at 6 in the morning. The same hands she'd always had. The ones that had learned their trade in places nobody in this building knew about, and had kept learning it every single shift since, in the fluorescent ordinary of a department that needed someone who showed up and paid attention and wrote things down and did not stop when the answer got complicated. Those were not small things. They had never been small things. She had known that. Now the world knew it too, and the difference between those two states of knowledge, private and public, invisible and seen, was real, but it was not the thing that mattered most. What mattered most was the work. It always had been. The night shift started at 11. She was there at 10:45, the way she always was, coffee in hand, checking the board, looking at what the day had left her and what the night was about to ask for. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And this time, the people around her knew it.